There's a side of human desire that most people never talk about, not because it doesn't exist, but because it's uncomfortable to face. We all crave connection, closeness, intimacy. But what happens when someone fears the very thing they deeply desire? What happens when love feels like both a magnet and a threat? Today, we're diving into the shadow side of avoidance, the hidden world where emotional distance and intense desire collide. This is not about blaming or labeling. This is about understanding the silent tension that lives beneath the surface. The push and pull, the craving and the withdrawal, the fire that burns but never fully settles. If you've ever felt confused by someone who seemed deeply attracted to you, yet emotionally unavailable, this is for you. At the core of the avoidant experience lies a contradiction that most people struggle to understand. The stronger their desire becomes, the stronger their instinct to pull away. This isn't random behavior. It's a deeply rooted psychological response that was built over time, often long before they ever entered your life. When an avoidant begins to feel attracted to someone, it doesn't register as simple excitement or curiosity. It quickly intensifies into something much deeper, something that feels like a loss of control. And for someone who has built their identity around self-reliance and emotional independence, that loss of control feels dangerous. So instead of allowing desire to naturally evolve into connection, their mind starts to create distance. At first, everything may feel perfect. They are engaged, present, even passionate. They lean in. They show interest. They make you feel seen in a way that feels rare and powerful. This is the phase where their desire is alive, where the connection still feels safe because it hasn't crossed into emotional dependency yet. But then something shifts. The moment the connection starts to deepen, when emotions become real, when consistency begins to form, when expectations quietly enter the space, that's when their internal alarm activates. It doesn't announce itself loudly. It shows up subtly. A delayed reply, a change in tone, a sudden need for space that wasn't there before. From the outside, it feels confusing. It feels like something went wrong. But inside them, something very specific is happening. Their desire hasn't disappeared. In fact, it may have intensified. But alongside that desire comes a rising fear. The fear of being needed, the fear of being depended on, the fear of losing their sense of autonomy. And instead of sitting with that fear, they respond the only way they know how, by creating emotional distance. This is where the push-pull dynamic begins. They move closer when they feel safe, and they retreat when things become emotionally real. It's not calculated. It's automatic, almost like a reflex. And the more intense the connection feels, the stronger that reflex becomes. What makes this even more complicated is that their withdrawal often happens at the exact moment you feel closest to them. Just when you think the bond is growing stronger, they begin to pull away. Not because they don't care, but because they care in a way that feels overwhelming, so they step back to regain control. They might distract themselves, focus on work, or emotionally detach just enough to create breathing room. And in doing so, they convince themselves that they're maintaining balance, when in reality, they're avoiding the very thing they desire most. This creates a cycle that can feel endless. They feel the connection. They move toward it. It becomes too real, and they retreat. And each time this cycle repeats, it reinforces their belief that closeness leads to discomfort, that intimacy leads to pressure, and that distance is the only place where they can truly feel safe. But beneath all of this is a truth they rarely express. They don't pull away because they don't feel enough. They pull away because they feel too much, and they don't know how to hold it. At a deeper level, avoidant behavior is not simply about distance. It is about emotional regulation. What appears on the surface as indifference or detachment is often a carefully constructed internal system designed to prevent emotional overwhelm. And nowhere does this system become more visible than in the way sexual desire and emotional intimacy interact within them. For many avoidants, sexual attraction is not just physical. It is one of the few spaces where closeness can be experienced without immediate emotional exposure. Physical intimacy feels structured. It has rules, boundaries, and a sense of control. It can be intense without requiring full emotional surrender. And this is exactly why desire can appear so strong and magnetic in the early stages of connection. In the beginning, when emotional expectations are low and the connection is still undefined, avoidance can express desire with surprising intensity. There can be strong chemistry, heightened attraction, and a sense of urgency that feels almost consuming. To the other person, it may look like deep emotional investment. But internally, the avoidant is still operating within a safe zone. Nothing has fully activated their fear system yet. However, as intimacy begins to shift from physical to emotional, the internal experience changes dramatically. Emotional closeness requires vulnerability. It requires being seen without control, without filters, without escape routes. And for someone whose nervous system associates vulnerability with potential emotional risk, this shift can feel destabilizing. This is where the shadow begins to emerge. Desire does not disappear. It becomes conflicted. On one side, there is attraction, longing, and genuine connection. On the other side, there is rising discomfort that does not always have a clear explanation. The body may still want closeness, but the mind starts to signal caution. And this internal split creates confusion in their behavior. They may initiate intimacy one moment and withdraw the next. They may express strong physical desire, but avoid emotional conversations that deepen attachment. They may seek closeness in controlled environments, but become distant when emotional depth starts to form naturally. This contradiction is not intentional. It is protective. For many avoidants, emotional closeness is not simply uncomfortable. It feels like exposure. And exposure can trigger a survival-based response, retreat. So even when they are drawn to someone deeply, there is an automatic counterforce that pushes them back into emotional safety. This is why their sexual intensity can sometimes feel disconnected from emotional availability. It is not a lack of feeling. It is a separation of feeling systems. One part of them engages through desire, while another part simultaneously protects through distance. And over time, this creates a pattern that confuses both sides of the relationship. The other person experiences inconsistency and begins to question the authenticity of the connection. Meanwhile, the avoidant experiences internal pressure they cannot easily articulate. They feel too much and too little at the same time. Too much desire to ignore the connection and too much fear to fully surrender to it. So they regulate by stepping back. They reduce contact. They slow emotional pacing. They create space not to punish or manipulate, but to reset their internal system. Distance becomes a form of emotional recovery, a way to restore balance between longing and fear. But the challenge is that this pattern reinforces itself. Every time they retreat and feel temporary relief, their brain associates distance with safety. And every time intimacy increases emotional intensity, their brain associates closeness with pressure. This creates a loop where desire and fear never fully integrate. And until that internal system is understood and consciously worked through, avoidants continue to live in this split reality, where connection is deeply wanted yet constantly filtered through the need for emotional control. Another layer of the avoidant pattern reveals itself in something most people completely misinterpret. Emotional withdrawal is not the absence of connection, but the overload of it. When someone with avoidant tendencies begins to feel emotionally or physically close to another person, their nervous system does not simply register comfort. It registers intensity. And intensity for them is not always experienced as pleasure. It can feel like pressure. What makes this especially complex is that avoidants are often highly attuned to connection. They notice subtle emotional shifts. They pick up on energy quickly. They may even feel deeply moved by intimacy. But instead of allowing that emotional wave to flow naturally, something inside them immediately begins to manage it, regulate it, and if necessary, reduce it. This is where distance becomes a coping mechanism. When emotional closeness reaches a certain threshold, the avoidance system begins to activate protective strategies. They may become quieter, less responsive, or suddenly more focused on external distractions. On the surface, it looks like disinterest, but internally, it is more like emotional saturation. They are not empty, They are full and unsure how to process what they are feeling. The shadow side of this experience is that desire and fear begin to merge in confusing ways. They can miss someone intensely and still avoid contact. They can feel strong attraction and still resist engagement. They can crave closeness and simultaneously feel overwhelmed by it. This duality creates a cycle where their internal experience and external behavior seem disconnected. For the person on the receiving end, this can feel unpredictable. One moment there is warmth, attention, and emotional or physical closeness. The next moment there is silence, distance, or emotional withdrawal. It is easy to interpret this as inconsistency or mixed signals, but from the avoidant perspective, it is often a form of self-regulation. When emotional intensity rises, they instinctively step back, not because they don't care, but because they care in a way that feels destabilizing. The deeper the attachment grows, the more urgent the need for emotional space becomes. And in that space, they attempt to regain a sense of internal balance. What is rarely understood is that avoidants are not trying to erase connection. They are trying to contain it, to keep it within a range that feels manageable. Because once connection begins to feel too consuming, it triggers an internal belief that they may lose themselves in it. So they create distance. They slow down communication. They become more selective with emotional sharing. They may even convince themselves that they are simply busy or not in the right headspace, when in reality, they are processing emotional overload. And during this time, something subtle happens internally. Desire does not fade. It reorganizes. Instead of being expressed directly, it becomes reflective. They think about the person more in absence than in presence. They feel the connection more strongly when it is not actively demanding emotional participation. This is why the cycle repeats. Closeness activates intensity. Intensity activates withdrawal. Withdrawal restores clarity. And clarity eventually reignites desire. But because this loop is never fully resolved, it creates a relationship rhythm that feels unstable from the outside, yet internally necessary from their perspective. The deeper shadow here is that avoidants often mistake regulation for disconnection. They believe that stepping back means they are losing interest, when in fact they are simply trying to regain emotional control. And until they learn to tolerate emotional intensity without retreating, this cycle continues, pulling them between longing and distance, desire and self-protection, connection and escape. At the deepest level of the avoidant pattern, there is a hidden emotional architecture that most people never see. It is not simply about fear of intimacy or difficulty with vulnerability. It is about identity protection. For many avoidants, closeness is not just an emotional experience. It is a perceived threat to their internal sense of self. And this is where the shadow becomes even more complex. When emotional or sexual attraction becomes strong, it doesn't just activate desire. It activates a quiet internal question: what will I become if I let this in fully? That question is rarely conscious, but it drives much of their behavior. Because deep down, closeness can feel like a loss of autonomy, a blurring of boundaries, or even a subtle disappearance of self-control. So instead of surrendering to connection, they begin to manage it. One of the most misunderstood aspects of avoidant behavior is that distance is not always emotional rejection. It is emotional recalibration. When things feel too intense, too meaningful, or too fast, they instinctively slow the pace. They reduce emotional exposure not because they are disengaged, but because their internal system is trying to restore equilibrium. This is where sexual desire often becomes entangled with emotional avoidance. In the early stages, attraction can feel effortless. There is excitement, curiosity, and a sense of magnetism. But as soon as emotional depth begins to form, when the connection starts to feel real, consistent, and emotionally significant, the avoidance system begins to sense potential vulnerability. And vulnerability for them is not just emotional openness. It is exposure without control. So a shift occurs. They may still feel desire, but it becomes fragmented. Instead of flowing naturally into connection, it gets split into compartments. Physical attraction may remain strong, but emotional availability becomes limited. They might express closeness in moments, then withdraw when emotional intimacy deepens beyond their comfort threshold. From the outside, this looks like inconsistency, but internally it feels like protection. Because in their mind, closeness carries risk. The risk of dependence, the risk of being hurt, the risk of losing emotional independence. And rather than consciously choosing distance, they often default to it as an automatic safety response. What makes this dynamic even more intense is that avoidance does not eliminate desire, it amplifies it in absence. When space is created, emotional and sexual longing often resurfaces more strongly. But when closeness returns, so does the internal pressure. This creates a repeating cycle where desire grows in distance and becomes complicated in proximity. And this is the hidden tension they live with. They are often not disconnected from feeling. They are overwhelmed by it in moments of intimacy, so they learn to regulate by stepping back, emotionally and sometimes physically. This gives them temporary relief, a sense of control, and the ability to process what feels unmanageable in real time. But the cost is continuity, because every time they retreat, the connection resets emotionally, and every time they return, they must navigate the same internal conflict again. The shadow here is subtle but powerful. They often confuse emotional safety with emotional distance. They believe that staying slightly detached protects the relationship, when in reality it prevents full emotional integration. And until that internal fear of losing self within connection is understood and healed, they remain caught in this loop, where desire is real, connection is possible, but full surrender always feels just out of reach. At the core of the avoidant experience lies a deeply embedded tension between craving intimacy and fearing its consequences. But what often goes unnoticed is how this tension reshapes not only their emotional world, but also their perception of desire itself. Over time, desire becomes something they both trust and distrust at the same time. They are drawn toward connection, yet wary of what that connection might demand from them. In moments of distance, avoidants often reconnect with their feelings more freely. Absence creates clarity. Space allows desire to surface without immediate emotional pressure. They may think about the person more intensely, feel waves of longing, or even idealize the connection. From this distance, everything feels safe, controlled, and emotionally manageable. Desire feels pure because it is not being tested by real-time vulnerability. But when closeness returns, the emotional landscape shifts again. Proximity introduces unpredictability. Conversations become deeper. Expectations, even unspoken ones, begin to form. Emotional availability becomes more present. And with that, an internal pressure begins to build. Not always in a dramatic way, but in subtle emotional signals: restlessness, irritation, numbness, or the sudden need for space. This is where the shadow side of avoidant desire becomes most visible. They are not simply pulling away from a person. They are often pulling away from the emotional intensity that connection activates within them. Because for avoidance, intimacy does not only represent love or bonding. It also represents responsibility, emotional exposure, and the possibility of being overwhelmed by someone else's needs or their own feelings. So they begin to regulate. This regulation is not always conscious. It happens through behavior shifts that seem small but carry emotional weight. Delayed responses, reduced enthusiasm, a sudden focus on independence, a subtle emotional flattening. These are not signs of absence of care. They are attempts to reduce internal overload. What makes this dynamic particularly complex is that avoidants often experience genuine emotional depth beneath this protective layer. They can feel attachment strongly, sometimes even more intensely than others, but the difference lies in how they process that intensity. Instead of moving toward deeper connection, they often move toward containment. Containment becomes the strategy. They may limit emotional expression, avoid prolonged vulnerability, or create mental narratives that justify distance. They might tell themselves they need space to think, or that they function better alone, when in reality they are trying to stabilize an internal emotional surge they do not fully understand how to hold. Meanwhile, desire does not disappear. It continues to exist beneath the surface, often resurfacing in cycles. After distance is created, longing returns. After reconnection, overwhelm returns. This creates a rhythm that feels inconsistent but internally logical to them. It is a cycle of activation and retreat, desire and regulation, connection and recalibration. The shadow here is that avoidants often mistake emotional overwhelm for incompatibility. When closeness feels too intense, they assume something is wrong with the relationship, rather than recognizing that the intensity is coming from within their own nervous system response to vulnerability. And so they step back, not because the desire is absent, but because the experience of desire feels too consuming to remain fully engaged with. Over time, this creates a pattern where relationships feel like they are constantly restarting. Emotional progress is made, then paused. Connection builds, then resets, and both sides are left trying to understand why something so real can still feel so unstable. But underneath it all, the truth remains consistent. The avoidant does not lack capacity for desire or connection. They lack safety in sustaining both at the same time. And until that internal safety is developed, their desire will continue to move in cycles, intense in presence, amplified in absence, and always filtered through the need to stay emotionally in control. At the deepest layer of the avoidant experience, there is a final and often misunderstood truth. Their emotional world is not built on a lack of feeling, but on a constant negotiation between intensity and safety. What appears on the surface as detachment or inconsistency is often the result of an internal system trying to manage emotional overwhelm in real time. For avoidance, connection does not simply happen. It is processed, measured, regulated. Every step toward emotional or physical intimacy is simultaneously evaluated by another internal system that asks, is this safe? Is this too much? Can I handle what this is becoming? And when the answer feels uncertain, distance becomes the default response. This is where the shadow side becomes most visible, not in their absence, but in their oscillation. They are not emotionally absent individuals. They are emotionally fluctuating individuals. One moment they are deeply engaged, expressive, and connected. The next moment they are distant, quiet, and internally withdrawn. This shift is not random, it is regulatory. When emotional closeness reaches a peak, something inside them begins to tighten. It is not always fear in the traditional sense. It is often a sense of internal saturation, as if too much emotional input is being processed at once. In that state, their system prioritizes relief over connection, and relief is found in space, so they step back. In that space, something interesting happens. The emotional pressure decreases, but the emotional awareness increases. They begin to reflect more clearly. They think more about the person. They feel the absence more sharply. Desire, which was momentarily submerged under emotional intensity, begins to resurface. This is why distance often intensifies longing. But when reconnection happens, the cycle resets. The emotional intensity returns. The nervous system becomes activated again, and once more, the need for regulation emerges. This creates a loop that feels confusing from the outside, but internally consistent for them. They are constantly moving between two states: engagement and regulation, desire and containment, closeness and recalibration. The shadow side of this dynamic is not that they do not value connection. It is that they struggle to sustain emotional presence when connection becomes too real. Presence requires tolerance for vulnerability. It requires sitting with emotional intensity without immediately trying to reduce it. And for avoidance, this tolerance is often underdeveloped or overwhelmed by learned protective responses. So instead of staying in the intensity, they step out of it. Not to end the connection, but to survive the emotional load it creates within them. This is why their behavior can feel paradoxical. They may express strong desire, deep attraction, even emotional attachment, but still withdraw when the experience becomes too consuming. Their actions are not aligned with a lack of feeling, but with a limit in emotional capacity at that moment. And this limit is often misread. People around them may interpret withdrawal as rejection, disinterest, or emotional unavailability. But in reality, it is often a form of self-regulation, a way to restore internal balance before re-engaging. The deeper truth is that avoidants are not avoiding love itself. They are avoiding the internal overwhelm that love activates when it moves beyond controlled boundaries. And until that internal threshold is expanded, until emotional intensity can be held without triggering retreat, the cycle continues. They come close. They feel deeply. They step back. They return again. Not because they are inconsistent in desire, but because their system is still learning how to stay present in it.